Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. In This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network, in 1939, on the 30th of September, the Polish government-in-exile was established in Paris. Władysław Sikorski becomes Prime Minister. Hitler issues Directive 5, which divides occupied Poland into parts. On the 1st of October, men between 20 and 22 are ordered to register with the British Army. On the 3rd of October, the Panama Conference of American Republics concludes with a declaration of neutrality. On the 4th of October, Hitler issues a secret decree granting amnesty for crimes committed by German military and police in Poland since the 1st of September. On the 5th of October, Hitler flies to Warsaw and reviews a victory parade, and that day the Soviet-Latvian Mutual Assistance Treaty provides naval and air bases in Latvia to the Soviets. In 1940, on the 3rd of October, Vichy France passes laws excluding Jews from most public and private occupations. Warsaw's Jews are ordered to move into the city's ghetto. On the 4th of October, Hitler and Mussolini meet in the Brenner Pass to discuss the possibility of Spain entering the war on their side. On the 5th of October, Richard Pearce replaces Charles Portal as Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command. In 1941, on the 29th of September, the Moscow Conference begins with representatives of Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union meeting in wartime for the first time. The US agrees to supply the Soviets with $1 billion worth of arms and equipment. SS squads begin massacring 34,000 Jews in the Babi Yar ravine outside Kiev. On the 30th of September, the Germans launch Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow. Majdanek concentration camp becomes operational. On the 3rd of October, Hitler says in a speech in Berlin that the Soviet Union was to a great extent already destroyed. And on the 4th of October, the first jet engine built by the Allies arrives in Boston to be modified for mass production by General Electric. In 1942, on the 30th of September, the second lookout raid on Oregon takes place. On the 1st of October, the Australian commandos raid Mubo in New Guinea, and that day, the Lisbon Maru is sunk by an American submarine. It was carrying 1,800 British prisoners of war. 800 of them die in the sinking. On the 3rd of October, the V-2 rocket becomes the first object to be launched into space. Roosevelt orders a freeze on wages, rents and farm prices. The British Operation Basalt raid on the Channel Island of Sark takes place, and the Hollywood Canteen, run by volunteers from the entertainment industry, opens in Los Angeles. On the 4th of October, the German 14 Panzer Corps attacks the Stalingrad tractor factory, and Hermann Goering says in a speech that Germany's food situation will continue to get better since we now possess huge stretches of fertile land. Well, there you are. We're looking at what happened in effectively the first week of October, last period of September, first week of October in 1939, 40, 41, 42. We'll be looking at 43, 44, 45 later in the show. So there's a number of talking points there. Now I'm going to bring in my co-host. That is Dr. Joe Quinn. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Eddie. How are you doing?
Very good, Joe. Again, a dramatic, I mean, it's just every month of every week of the war is a dramatic moment, but for different reasons. And we had essentially the dissolution and the sight of Hitler in Warsaw, not much more after the month the war started. And then the dissolution, everything like that went on after that. So anyway, Jen, looking at those 39, 40, 41, 42, let's start at 39. Anything there that you think is particularly striking?
Yes, well, definitely with regard to Poland, you have shall we say, the complete defeat of Poland as a major ally, and it would have been in some respects a major ally within the Allied camp in terms of the sheer size of the country, the size of the army that they fielded as well. It may not have been quite as large as the German army, but it was a considerable force. Massively under-equipped and wouldn't say massively underprepared. They had been preparing for war for quite some time, but they didn't quite have the right armament in order to take on their German adversaries. So they were defeated within really a 3-week period and comprehensively as a field army. And there are obviously guerrilla actions in various different places, but for the most part, at this particular point in sort of the end of September, beginning of October 1939, all resistance to the invading and then occupying German forces has effectively ceased. You have the division of Poland between the Soviet zone to the east and the Germans controlling much of Polish territory to the west. And much of the territory that the Soviets take possession of is actually falls within the sphere of Poland that is claimed under the Yalta Conference, under the Yalta Agreement in 1945. So this is the part of Poland that is ceded to the Soviet Union and becomes part of Soviet Ukraine, while Poland shifts westward and takes territory from Germany. So essentially the Polish state will later shift towards the west by a factor of anywhere between 70 to 90 miles in either direction in terms of the shifting of borders on both the eastern and western frontiers. But the process of this really begins formally with the effective annexation of Polish territory by the Soviets in 1939, and you have Hitler reviewing the victory parade in Warsaw at the end of the month, beginning of October. He's in Warsaw, and it wasn't his first visit to Poland during this particular period. He actually flew over Danzig while Danzig was being attacked in the early days of the war. So when it came to Poland, Hitler was rather a bit more adventurous than the person that he later became towards the end of the war. Hiding in bunkers. He wasn't afraid to get up in a plane, being a person who was afraid of heights, and actually survey a country that he was in the process of conquering. But I think that one particularly interesting point is what actually happens in terms of long-term ongoing Polish resistance towards German occupation of their homeland. You have the setting up of a Polish government of exile in Paris, which will later move to London after the fall of France in 1940. And in Paris, you have Władysław Raczkiewicz and also General Władysław Sikorski becoming president and prime minister, respectively. Now, of the two, the name that we will remember the most is Sikorski. General Sikorski becomes, in effect, the de facto head of the Polish government of exile. So essentially, he is the representative figure. He's effectively the head of state of this decapitated state of Poland, and all resistors to German occupation, all those who stand against the Nazi domination of Poland, will rally to the flag that he holds wherever he stands. And he's a hugely symbolic figure. It's very important to remember that Sikorski in his day was a hugely important figure around the world. He was effectively the head of state of Poland, Free Poland, and he commanded authority over all Polish forces in exile that served first with the French and then with the British forces. That included naval forces, that included considerable air forces that served within the Royal Air Force. There were ultimately, by the end of the war, over 100,000, believe it or not, Poles in serving within the Polish Air Force that was set up within the Royal Air Force. So effectively Poles in the Royal Air Force, but they were serving as an independent air force within the RAF, wearing RAF uniforms and obviously under RAF command. But they were recognized as an air force within an air force. sort of an air force in exile, and they were very well equipped, they were very well experienced. They made up the best of what the Royal Air Force had to offer during the war, particularly in the Battle of Britain, where a Polish squadron actually shot down more aircraft than any other fighter squadron. That was 303 Squadron. And then, of course, you have the Polish Army. You have a lot of Polish Army units that fall directly under the command of the Polish government of exile. And this number increases when an entire corps of captured Polish soldiers are repatriated from the Soviet Union under agreement between the British government and the Soviet government. These are Polish soldiers that were captured by the Soviets when they moved into Eastern Poland in 1939. These Poles are later released in 1941, and they are allowed go into Central Asia, the Middle East area, into Allied occupied territory, where they are trained, up, equipped, they're given uniforms, and they serve under the flag of the British and Commonwealth forces. And they form a corps. There were about between 25 and 30 army corps within the British and Commonwealth forces globally during the Second World War. One of those corps was 2 Polish corps. It made up an entire corps within the British Army globally, and these were entirely Polish soldiers, and they add to the numbers that are already serving in the army. So you've got considerable forces that fall under Sikorski's command. But as we will see at a later point in the series, Sikorski's career during the war is due, unfortunately, to be short-lived, and he dies tragically in an air accident at a particular point midway through the war under very controversial circumstances, as we will discuss at another point.
Yes, I mean, one of the things also about the way that Poland was treated, I mean, Nazi Germany never declared war against Poland. They treated it as a special military operation. It was not. It was a police action. And they just dismembered the country. So they annexed Silesia and other parts. And then this area called the General Government, which was the place where the bulk of the industrialized Holocaust took place. That was run by a gentleman called Hans Frank, who was, at the end of the war, of course, executed for war crimes. And then you had the process that went on with the ghettoization process, the expulsion of Jews, a horrible, horrible process. I look at the 1940, and Franco's a forgotten figure nowadays. Who talks about General Franco? But when I was growing up, of course, Spain wasn't a democracy, a parliamentary democracy as we know it now. It was, to a great extent, a military dictatorship. Franco had come to power in effectively 1938 when he won the Civil War, and he was still in power almost 40 years later. And you have this moment when Mussolini and Hitler both try to persuade Franco to join the Axis forces. There they are in the full pomp. It looks like they're winning, and they make an offer to Franco. Now, Franco remained neutral, but it's a peculiar kind of neutrality. We know that when the British and Americans landed in Morocco and Algeria, one of the concerns was that the Spanish forces in what was then northern Morocco, occupied forces, would actually the Americans and British would have to fight them. Possibility that at this period that the Spanish would go for Gibraltar. How would you evaluate Spain's or Franco's position towards the war in 1940? In the end, he said no, but how close do you think he ever was to throwing Spain behind the Axis powers of Italy and Germany and others? And why didn't he take that choice?
I don't really think that he was ever close to committing Spain to the Second World War. And I don't think any of his acolytes, any of his advisors within, bear in mind that Franco was an army general. He was the youngest at the time. He took command of the Spanish Nationalist Army and then became head of state. He was actually the youngest brigadier general of any army in Europe. So he was a sort of a rising star within the Spanish army at that time. And the Spanish army was a very conservative institution. It was very close, it was very close to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had an official position within the Spanish army. They had chaplains. You also had a lot of people who were Carlist monarchists who were within the army. And also it was the institution which naturally the Falanca, the Spanish fascist organization, which wasn't actually terribly powerful before Franco's and the nationalists attempted coup in Madrid, which failed, leading to the outbreak of civil war. It wasn't actually a very powerful organization, or not as powerful as one would think. And it was really through the influence of the army and ultimately the nationalist army's victory in the Civil War, with the assistance of their German and Italian allies, that actually ultimately helped propel the Phalangists to power. But they were by no means the most popular force within Spanish politics. In Spain, the strength of the left, whether you be anarchist, communist, socialist, or whatever spectrum of the left suited you, that was an overwhelmingly more popular position to take politically than it was to be in a sort of a conservative party or within a conservative movement. But the truth about it is that there was a very revolutionary zeal within Spain, and as a result, Spain was very destabilized as a society. There was anti-clericalism, anti-Catholicism, and the regime that Franco governed when he came to power at the end of the Civil War, 39, Civil War more or less tapers off. Resistance continues in certain parts. This is the very important point. The Civil War doesn't really formally actually come to an end. Most people think it ends in 39. It's just that what happens is that the Republican forces, this is basically the anti-Franco, anti-nationalist forces, have really been comprehensively defeated in terms of conventional warfare. So they're no longer able to mount effective conventional resistance. The nationalists are overwhelmingly powerful. They're more disciplined. They're better supplied by their fascist allies in Europe, particularly Germany, and who are employing technologically more superior weapons. And they're also calling upon colonial troops from North Africa, which play a huge part in the Civil War. And what ultimately happens is you have pockets of resistance in different parts of the country, particularly in the north and Basque Country, and guerrilla units still on the go. And this continues right throughout the Second World War. So also Spain is absolutely devastated in many places. Cities have been pummeled to rubble. The country's economy has been virtually destroyed. The country is really on its knees. So this is not a country that could effectively engage in the Second World War in a very meaningful sense. They have to remain at home to provide security. But what Franco ultimately, when he meets Hitler, he considers what Hitler is telling him, but ultimately argues with it. And Hitler goes away from the meeting in 1940 that takes place around the Pyrenees. There's basically a railway journey that takes place. They meet each other in a sort of a kind of a mountainous area not far from Andorra. And really what happens is basically Hitler comes away from the meeting feeling very frustrated, very angry, feeling that he's been gulled, or basically had the wool pulled over his eyes, because he's led to believe that this new the caudillo Spain will actually be amenable to an alliance with the Führer, and in fact actually is just playing games with them. And
it's an interesting parallel.
Hitler said that, actually, just to conclude this point, he said about Franco that having a conversation with that man was like having your teeth been pulled. And we all know that Hitler didn't like trips to the dentist because he had very bad teeth. Yeah.
Well, no, the interesting parallel, isn't it? You can see the parallel between the Francoist regime and the Mussolini regime. I mean, obviously, the economic conditions were different, and they hadn't had a civil war in Italy and Spain. They had, but ideologically, you could see similar sort of trends. And and it's just it makes you wonder that if Mussolini had done what Franco had done, I might have seen him. He might have survived like Franco and would have finished up and seen him in the 50s and 60s as a reviled yet still breathing person. And it's an interesting thought. But let's move on.
Can I just come in on that point? I just wanted to make the point that I think what Mussolini did by committing Italy to the war was the mistake that Franco was unwilling to make. I think Mussolini overestimated his country's ability to be able to wage war during the Second World War, and that his decision to enter the war in 1940 was a colossal mistake. A lot of historians recognize that, and they often there's the big what if Italy had stayed out and not come into the war at Hitler's side. I think what Franco did was he correctly assessed. He was, unlike Hitler and unlike Mussolini, who, sort of were in many respects down and outs in former lives and had no military experience. Franco had actually been a successful professional soldier. He'd been a successful general. He had actually been a success in his career, and he'd been very thoughtful, inventive. He thought about things in terms of being a general, in terms of being a military commander, and he assessed his country's ability to enter the war, and he worked out that it wasn't going to work from Spain's point of view. And thank God, because if he had moved against Gibraltar, I mean, that would have been a turning point, a very serious turning point in terms of the Allied ability to win the Second World War, because Gibraltar was one of these key nodal points in terms of the British Imperial Commonwealth and also Allied supply infrastructure globally. I mean, Gibraltar was absolutely essential. And if Franco had joined the war and if he had seized Gibraltar, frankly, the British would have been stuffed.
Yeah, and the thing about Franco, he didn't have any imperial designs. There was no desire to restore the Spanish Empire, unlike Mussolini, who wanted to restore the Roman Empire. Anyway, let's look at 1941. The big event is Operation Typhoon. I mean, it's a monumental war is going on in the what is now the Soviet Union, and the Germans are already failing to achieve their objectives. So we're into the start of October, and they already know they're behind schedule. They thought they could knock out the Soviets by this point, and they got it all wrong. Hitler was in an incredible hurry. And so Operation Typhoon starts. I mean, how would you rate Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow? Do you think it's mentioned, but it's not a real pivotal point? Everyone talks about Stalingrad, but do you think the fact that the Operation Typhoon, the attempt by the Third Reich on the Axis forces to take Moscow, was the pivotal moment, and that after that it was bound to be all downhill?
Well, certainly the opinion of historians like James Holland is that by the time, once it was clear that and it was actually quite clear to anybody who really, I mean, if you fail to take Moscow in 41, really with the timeline, the time schedule that Hitler has and the amount of resources that he's committed to invading the Soviet Union, taking Moscow is more of a symbolic victory than anything else. It obviously would be a key strategic victory, but it's such a symbolic victory that it might have the effect of causing the Soviet Union to collapse, a collapse of essentially the Soviet state and resistance falling therein, or maybe perhaps a division, possibly a defection of certain people within the Soviet government over to the German side, the setting up of puppet states, and so on and so forth. The truth about it is we don't know what would have happened if Moscow had fallen to the Germans in 1941. But one thing we do know is that because of the delays in the schedule of Barbarossa, and because of the fact that Hitler directly interfered with the autonomy of his commanders on the ground, the commanders of, Army Groups B and Army Group C, basically, the Southern Army Groups and also the Central Army Groups, particularly the one that was supposed to be moving on Smolensk and then on to Moscow. The fact that forces were constantly being diverted in this direction and this direction, rather than concentrating on the central task of making it to Moscow as quickly as possible, which they could potentially have done if they'd planned more effectively for it and if there had been less interference. This leads to critical delays, which means that they are not really in a position to move from Smolensk onto Moscow until well into the autumn. So we're at this particular point in the autumn. You look outside, it's still quite dry, but it's starting to get more damp. The ground is starting to become softer. And one of the things that happens in the Soviet Union, particularly in Western Russia at this particular point, is that there are heavy rains that come down, and it's basically a seasonal thing where you have rainstorms. And with the German advance and with the moving of heavy vehicles, particularly tanks, heavy motorized tracked vehicles and other forms of trucks and whatnot, essentially it generates a quagmire and you have German vehicles basically bogged down in oceans of mud, on basically in fields and on steeps of Western Russia, and it's an absolute catastrophe. And there's areas, whole forests basically between Smolensk and Moscow, where the Germans try to go around, and they're effectively wading up to their knees in water because these forests are waterlogged from all the deluge of rainfall. And essentially they're battling these horrific conditions, this muddy weather, this wet weather, which is basically slowing them up and effectively bogging them down. And they lose about a month and a half of very crucial time because they're fighting against the weather as well as fighting the enemy, who are actually getting stronger and stronger with all of these delays and are able to reinforce more and more effectively. And by the time they're ready to move on Moscow and everything, suddenly the weather, the temperatures drop, it begins to snow, the ground hardens, and suddenly they're able to move again. They're facing an altogether different kind of reality, which is basically it's the Russian winter. It's the fact that their equipment is not really, even their weapons are not really equipped to cope with these rough weather conditions. They don't have proper greatcoats or proper winter gear, winter equipment, because they went in their summer gear. They thought they'd be in Moscow by the time the winter hit. And the Soviets are already heavily reinforcing from the east. So the problem with Typhoon is a problem of time. The timing is way off, and they're bringing too few resources to bear in order to propel that advance. You also have, one last thing I would say, is you have very large, considerably large towns, cities, and urban areas between Smolensk and Moscow. And actually, the closer you get to Moscow, the more you are brushing up against these big urban centers, places like Vyazma and Orel and different other places. And essentially pockets of resistance, very heavy resistance, develop around these key urban centers, which really hold the Germans up. And you've massive battles taking place around the Orel and Vyazma salients. And these later become critical at the other side of the Typhoon offensive of Moscow. When that fails and the Soviets counterattack, these become sites of big battles where the Germans are actually at risk of being cut off and where they actually have to be saved through airlifts and so on. So ultimately, because of the failure of Hitler, because of his interfering and because of his lack of foresight in terms of strategic command on the ground and his lack of ability to allow the generals who are in charge of Barbarossa to actually do their jobs, he makes an already very bad situation much worse.
Yeah. So we're going to hear much more about that as we move on through the winter of 1941 into the spring of 42. The last thing on is 1942. The thing that interests me, and I'm going to raise a broad question, the V2, which is the first missile ever launched. It was launched by the Germans. I mean, what an incredible technological development that is. And we also saw the jet engine being made. It was made in Britain and it was shipped over to America and they mass produced it. And then, of course, we have the atomic technology. To what extent, in hindsight, looking back, do you think the Second World War was really underneath it, or to a great extent, a war of technology?
I think that the Second World War was primarily a war of, it was a war of mass manpower. I don't think we can get around that in the same way that the First World War was. It had to be considered in that light because of the scale of the war that took place on the Eastern Front. I mean, the First World War saw mass warfare, mass mobilization of huge amounts of manpower, massive armies, and also workforces being mobilized, women in the factories and whatnot. So we are really at the same time talking about a global conflict that involves the mobilization and the displacement of hundreds of millions of people, really globally, in very many areas on a scale that actually we still fail to appreciate to this day. So it has to be considered first and foremost to be very much a war of mass human mobilization. However, the Second World War at the same time is also the first truly modern technological war. It is the first digital war because of the way in which the bomber war was waged by the Americans over Europe in from 1942-43 until 45. You have, the use of digital technology. Essentially, the Americans are effectively been directed onto their targets through computerized technology and through radio direction finding. You have all that technology been brought to play in a very big way. But a lot of people don't realize this, but actually the bombers that the Americans deployed to Europe were very highly, highly advanced, and this technology had been honed in the late 1930s and early 40s, and it was designed that way so that essentially these bomber fleets would be directed, digitally directed to their targets. So, we have to look back at the First World War in terms of how warfare evolved. We started off the First World War with cavalry charges and with, massed artillery being used at different points, whatever, the way wars had been traditionally fought at the start of that war. And by the end, we had aerial warfare, we had bombers, we had fighters, essentially we had blitzkrieg tactics being used by the British. They were the ones that really pioneered this. You had a computer-controlled artillery by the end of the Second World War. And you had tanks, you had all this equipment, all this gear, which had never been seen before. And it's really in the Second World War that a lot of this equipment is brought to bear, in a way that we've never really seen before. And where effectively the modern powers, the British, the Americans, and then also the Germans as well, are using this very, very highly advanced military hardware in a way that it hasn't really been, nobody really knows how to use this equipment in the most effective way when the war starts. The Germans pioneered the best way of using it, studying British tactics at the end of the First World War. But it takes a long time before the British and Americans find their particular way of war and how to use this technology in the right way. But there are massive technological advances and huge leaps that are taken during the Second World War. You have, Edmund Hillary is able to climb Mount Everest because of the kit that British bomber crews develop, in order to breathe at altitudes where there is basically no oxygen, there's no breathable air. You have also the creation of atomic weapons, and you also have the creation of stuff that we are now familiar today, the creation of missiles, basically, that are directed onto their targets. Effectively, what would you call it, with guidance systems on board. And you also have drones. This is all stuff that people could have barely dreamed about 50 years beforehand, but is really pioneered to a very high level by the end of the Second World War. And this in turn gives birth to the kind of, shall we say, the kind of technology that we saw taking a very prominent place during the Cold War, the stuff that we lived in fear of or were living in the shadow of throughout much of the Cold War.
Yes, it is astonishing, the technological developments. And of course, Germans had massive capability in industry, and it's amazing their tanks and their guns. Britain had, the naval technology and the air technology. But the Soviets, it's often ignored, the Soviets were an industrial power, became industrial power during the war, and they made very significant technological breakthroughs as well. But anyway, look what we're going to do now, Joe. We're going to move on to the next 43, 44, 45. So we've got another pre-record, so let's do that now. In 1943, on the 29th of September, Italy's Prime Minister Pietro Badoglio signs Italy's Articles of Surrender in Malta. On the 30th of September, the 4 days of Naples uprising ends with the liberation of the city. On the 2nd of October, Japan eliminates student exemptions from the armed forces. The Tudor Vladimirescu Division of Romanian Prisoners of War is formed in the Soviet Union. Hans Frank creates the Staatsgericht, a court with authority to approve executions in Poland. The Second Battle of Smolensk ends in Soviet victory. On the 3rd of October, Charles de Gaulle becomes the sole leader of France's Committee for National Liberation. SS General Dr. Werner Best declares Denmark to be Judenfrei. British commandos land in Termoli on the Adriatic coast in Operation Devon. And on the 4th of October, the battle for the island of Kos begins. It ends the next day with the execution of more than 100 Italian officers. Corsica is liberated that day by the Allies after a battle of 25 days. The Battle of Dumpu in New Guinea ends in Allied victory, and the Battle of Drasjovica ends in victory for the Albanian resistance. In 1944, on the 30th of September, the German garrison in Calais surrenders to Canadian forces. The Germans launch a counter-offensive to retake the Nijmegen salient in the Netherlands. On the 1st of October, Richard McCreary replaces Oliver Leese as commander of the 8th Army. 4 divisions in the 5th Army attack in the northern Apennines to break through to Bologna. On the 2nd of October, the Warsaw Uprising ends after 2 months fighting. The battles of Aachen and the River Schelde begin that day. On the 4th of October, the 5th Army suspends its attack towards Bologna. Allied planes bomb Prague for the first time. Milan Nedic's puppet government in Serbia is disbanded. On the 5th of October, the Battle of Memel begins on the Eastern Front. Joseph Goebbels announces a reduction in German food rations. The Mazzoboto massacre, in which 770 Italian civilians are killed, ends. And the Canadian Air Force shoots down a German jet fighter over the Netherlands. In 1945, on the 1st of October, King Leopold III of Belgium arrives in Switzerland from Austria. A proclamation to the Belgian people defended his actions during the war. Leopold said that if he met with Hitler, it was to better the lot of Belgian prisoners of war and obtain bread for your families. He abdicated in 1951, aged 49. On the 2nd of October, as a result of his controversial remarks about denazification, George Patton is relieved as US 3rd Army Commander in Bavaria, and he is made head of a unit compiling a military history of the war in Germany. He dies as the result of a car crash on the 21st of December. And on the 4th of October, the trial of Vichy French Prime Minister Pierre Laval begins in Paris. He is found guilty of collaboration and treason and executed by firing squad on the 15th of October, 1945. Well, Joe, look, there we are with that's a 3-year period. Italy, I followed Italy very closely, and obviously the fact that Badoglio went to Malta, signed the official surrender, and then I think within a month, Italy, under his government, the Prime Minister of Italy had declared war and had become a full co-belligerent. So for me, of course, my dad at this point mentioned the kind of landings in Termoli on the Adriatic coast. So my dad was there, so in the Irish Brigade. So anything else from 43 that caught your eye that you thought you're going to make a point about?
I was just going to say that the fact that Charles de Gaulle, and I know we're talking about a lot of leaders of governments in exile, so Charles de Gaulle was obviously a general in the French army who was he was a field commander in 1940 when France was collapsing, a very effective one. But he ended up having to leave France because he refused to go along with what we heard about Pierre Laval and also Pétain. He disagreed with them in terms of their decision to make peace or sign an armistice with the Germans. And he wanted to continue the resistance. He felt that France could continue resisting and that it was really up to France to actually put a stop and organize itself and put a stop to the German advance within France, that he felt that there was a lack of will to resist. And so he continues the resistance and becomes head of the Free French government in exile in London. But what happens is that Charles de Gaulle, very controversially, becomes the sole leader of the, it's known as the Committee for National Liberation. This is effectively the Free French government or Free French Governing Council, essentially, that is tied to the Allied cause, fighting for the liberation of France and diametrically opposed to Vichy France during the Second World War. But the appointment of de Gaulle, or rather his own assuming of power within the Committee for National Liberation, which should by right have had been led by a civilian. The fact that a French general is taking sole command of this committee essentially puts him in pole position to declare himself the leader of France after it is liberated by the Allies, which is not something that a lot of Allied leaders, particularly Roosevelt, are willing to go along with. And, there is a very famous, sort of a quotation from an argument that Franklin D. Roosevelt had with his wife, Eleanor, the First Lady, over de Gaulle and his own particular intransigent views of de Gaulle, his contempt for de Gaulle, which was shared by a lot of people within the American government, within the American federal government, and particularly among American commanders, who had no time for de Gaulle at all and considered him not to be somebody that could be trusted or that they could work with. And when Eleanor Roosevelt declared that why he could not discuss with de Gaulle the arrangements for post-war France, and stated that he is, after all, the leader of Free France, FDR boldly basically he effectively argued the other way around. He said he's not the head of Free France, he's the head of a committee. And that is the way that he framed it. He basically considered de Gaulle to be an illegitimate leader. And so it's a very controversial moot point about, sort of how one of these great 20th century leaders was actually in reality seen by the people that he was working with, the people that he was allied to, including Churchill, including Roosevelt, and also many of their advisors and military commanders.
Yes, of course. At this point, the liberation, de Gaulle was based in Algiers. So he'd left London. He was in Algiers, which was, from a constitutional point of view, it was part of France. He was in France. And so the politics of what was going on is fascinating. The reverberations just go on and on. Looking at 1944, I mean, I can't help it. I have to mention Richard McCreary, who at this point in October 1944, he became the commander of the 8th Army. He replaced Oliver Leese, who Mark Clark, who was commander of the 5th Army, simply couldn't abide. He couldn't abide. And in his diaries, he writes, he just really had difficulty with Oliver Leese. Oliver Leese, I think on one occasion in a meeting of the generals, Oliver Leese was lying on his back as the meeting was taking place. So Oliver Leese was displaced, moved out to the Far East. I think, generally speaking, he was seen to be unsuccessful as commander of the 8th Army with the attempt to break through to the Po Valley, which started in August 1944. So Richard McCreary is pulled in. I mean, he really does fit the bill as a soldier's soldier, doesn't he? I think he gets a very good post-war press. He was a cavalry officer. He was actually of Northern Irish descent, very wealthy family. But he was, is that a fair assessment that McCreary would be counted as one of the best 5 British generals of the Second World War?
I have no real opinion on the issue. I suppose I have a certain knowledge of, which generals within, shall we say, British High Command or within the British and Commonwealth elite, members of, as they are known, members of the Imperial General Staff, which ones would be among the most competent. And I know that McCreary was very highly rated. He was a very effective officer. He had demonstrated his ability to, effectively coordinate, an army corps, with great distinction. And also he was a very affable individual. He was somebody that was considered to be among the top British commanders, particularly in the Italian campaign. And he had demonstrated, and he was very well liked. I have to say that, 8th Army was a complicated one. I mean, McCreary's replacement of Oliver Leese as the commander we're talking about 7, possibly 8 commanders at this particular point that have commanded 8th Army, going from Wavell right through to McCreary, possibly 9, I think. So the 8th Army is as an army formation, and I know it's not unusual for armies to have commanders replaced, particularly as other commanders are moved off, either in some cases for incompetence, but in other cases it's because they've demonstrated themselves to be extremely competent and are needed elsewhere to take command, not just of armies, but of army groups, particularly in the invasion of Europe. 8th Army was a problem, as arguably the most important army of all the British armies during the Second World War. It is one that suffered very badly from want of commanders who were consistently competent right across the board. And they also ended up, and there was one appointee to the position of commander of 8th Army and also commander-in-chief of Middle East, who died in a plane crash in North Africa. And that was the appointment. I can't remember his name, but that was the appointment in between Auchinleck and also Montgomery. And sorry?
Richie.
I don't think it was Richie. I don't think it was Richie.
We're just going to have to check. But it is true. The 8th Army's reputation was basically based upon the achievements in North Africa and the Battle of El Alamein. And after that, once it got to the Italian mainland, it suffered from a whole host of issues. One was the strategy itself. Secondly was the change in command. Montgomery got out as quickly as he could, went to Europe. And then, of course, the transfers out of key formations. And so by the end of the war, the 8th Army had huge numbers of people who couldn't even speak English. So you had a general who was dealing with people who could only speak Polish, Italian. They had the Indian formations.
Yes.
So it was never going to be something that your reputation would flourish on. And then, of course, the great victory was in Northwest Europe and in France and Germany, not in Italy. Last one point, which is moving on to 45, and this, you got 3. You've got the King of Belgium, who, and we're not going to in it, but he had a very controversial war. He had surrendered. He'd actually met Hitler during the war, and that's why he referred to it when he came back from Austria. He'd been detained in Germany, but he came back in Switzerland. He said, if I met Hitler, it's because I had to. He didn't survive long, and he was replaced. And to some certain extent, you can argue that the political issues that Belgium has today can trace back to the destruction of the legitimacy of the Belgian royal family associated with that period. He came off very badly. Patton, of course, famously, and you see the film about him, he makes these impolitic statements to the press about, the Nazis are just like the Democrats and the Republicans.
Yes. I think the line is specific. The specific line is, a journalist actually suggests, after all, sir, isn't. Patton is very down on the whole idea of denazification and of basically outing people who are Nazi party members in terms of the appointing of post-war administrations across, because bear in mind, Germany is not just one contiguous state entity. It is Germany is a country that's made up of independent autonomous states, even to this day, and they all have their own governments. So basically you have a big emphasis on local government and state government as well as federal. It's a federal republic. So they are reconstituting, particularly in West Germany, they're reconstituting the apparatus of a federal republican state. And they need to appoint people who know how to govern, because there's a lot of government officials that they will need in posts as well as civil servants. And the only people they can appoint from the population of Germany are people who have served in the Nazi regime. They would have all have been Nazi party members. So an argument is made by a journalist when Patton basically is expressing his own misgivings about this Allied policy. And the journalist says something to the effect of, after all, General, didn't most people here in Germany become Nazis in the same way those of us back home become Republicans or Democrats? And Patton just basically, in the movie, the portrayal of Patton is essentially along the lines of...
that's more or less what he said. Yeah. Which is... But anyway, he's...
The press stitched him up. The press were always stitching him up.
So, and he was good press. And then, of course, he died in a car crash in Germany on the 21st of December.
Yes, and do you believe the Patton conspiracy theories?
Yes, they're not the only one. And then Pierre Laval. Yeah. God's sake, he can't summarise his career, a not lengthy political career. Started off as a socialist, defender of the working man, then became an independent. He was prime minister twice before the Second World War. Was in the original Vichy government, left, and then came back in. Now, it's difficult to read the account of what happened without concluding to an extent, and I'm not here to apologise for anybody who was collaborating with the Nazis. It was a bit of a public lynching with Laval, wasn't it? I mean, he really was. He was tried, sentenced, and executed in about 2 weeks.
Yeah. Pétain actually didn't get off too much better. I mean, one of the things that struck me about Laval is that actually when he's arrested or when he's on trial and sort of, you see all the photographs of him, he looks like, well, frankly, a tramp that you'd find under a bridge in Paris. He looks very shabby, sort of he's got, stubble, he's, sort of his mustache is untrimmed, his hair is unkempt, matted even. He looks rather disheveled, and it wasn't that he was in hiding for any particularly long period of time after the fall of the regime. He was, he was an odd character, and he was very different to Pétain in many respects, and they weren't necessarily the best of bedfellows. The Vichy regime, which is not, I must confess, not something that I know a huge amount about, was made up of a lot of, sort of odd misfit characters. You had people who'd been former socialists, you had people who'd been in the center, a lot of people on the right, a lot of people who were just basically functionaries within the French state, some of whom would have been, good friends or good acolytes of Paul Renaud and Daladier, and various different, sort of figures within the pre-war French regime, or the French government, when it was under the Third Republic. And a lot of misfits and a lot of oddly placed characters who are kind of forced to work together within this weird apparatus of government within what is effectively a semi-autonomous entity in the south of France. It was a very odd story. It was very peculiar. I mean, even if you look at the story of Admiral Darlan, Darlan, and Darlan, how he comes to an end. I mean, Darlan,
single gunman had put him off, so they killed him. Very conveniently it was as well. At the end of 42.
Yes. I mean, his demise was quite a sad one because Darlan was actually considered to be a key sort of potential resistance figure. And actually, they say that in 1940, quite a lot rested on him. I mean, if he decided to go with Pétain and actually do a deal with Hitler, or, sort of go along with the armistice and accept the terms that the Germans were offering, collaborate, in effect, or if he decided to go against it, that quite a lot of France and quite a lot of the armed forces of France would have followed him. In many respects, Darlan, that was one of the great missed opportunities. Darlan would have been a far more symbolic leader of a free France than de Gaulle ever would have been, in many respects.
Okay, look, Joe, look, you're disappearing because you look like you're in a darkened room.
I need to switch the light on. It's a sign of the evenings, sort of the darkness drawing in. Yeah.
So what we're going to do, I'm just going to say goodbye to you now, and I'm just going to say a last word, and then we're going to play the last closing credits. Anyway, there we are. We covered a lot of ground on this episode. It's episode 4 of This Week in the Second World War. Really appreciate Joe Quinn's expert contribution, covering a lot of ground. As you can see, there's high politics, there's strategy, there's tactics, there's technology. The Second World War is endlessly fascinating. You can talk about it day after day after day if you're not careful. I try to avoid talking about it all the time. But anyway, I'm glad that you've watched us. We are very pleased to have the audience we've got. We will be continuing with our journey through the Second World War, taking it on a week-by-week basis, looking chronologically at the months and the weeks as we go forward in the way that we've done, allowing us to develop and pick up strands as we go. So that's it for today. We'll be back next week with another episode of This Week in the Second World War. So until then, from everybody here is goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.
you.